Picture this, the summer of 1324. You're standing at the edge of Cairo, the most powerful city in the Islamic world. The air is thick with heat and dust. You hear a sound like distant thunder rolling across the desert. But it's not a storm. It's not an army. It's something the world has never seen before. A man is coming, a king. And he's carrying so much gold that he's about to destroy an entire economy without lifting a sword. We're told that Mansa Musa was the richest man in history. We're told he was generous, pious, and kind. But here's the truth they don't teach you in school. Mansa Musa didn't just spend money. He committed economic warfare. He crashed currencies. He triggered hyperinflation. He bankrupted merchants who welcomed him with open arms. This is not a story about wealth. This is a story about what happens when one man brings too much gold to a party. This is a story about the ledger. And the ledger always wins. Let's rewind. Let's go back to West Africa in the early 14th century. While Europe was freezing through the Little Ice Age and burying its dead from the plague, the Mali Empire was thriving. This was not some backwater kingdom. This was a superpower. The empire stretched across thousands of miles of savanna, encompassing what we now call Mali, Senegal, Gambia, and Guinea. Travelers wrote that you could walk from one end of the empire to the other with a plate of gold on your head. No one would touch you. The law was absolute. But the real power of Mali wasn't its army or its size. It was what lay beneath the red earth. Mali sat on top of 3 massive gold fields, Bambouk, Bouré, and Galam. These weren't just mines. They were geological anomalies. The gold was so abundant that during the rainy season, it would wash up to the surface. Farmers found nuggets while digging for yams. Children played with flakes of it in the riverbeds. Mali was the Saudi Arabia of the medieval world. Except instead of oil, they had gold. And gold was the reserve currency of the planet. Historians estimate that nearly half of all the gold circulating in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa came from Mali. Every gold coin minted in Florence, every ducat spent in Venice, every dinar changing hands in Cairo, it all traced back to the mines of West Africa. Mali wasn't just rich. Mali was the engine of the global economy. And in 1312, a man named Mansa Musa took the throne. He inherited an empire that printed money, literally. But Musa had a problem. He was devout. He was a Muslim. And Islam required him to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in his life. Most pilgrims traveled quietly, humbly, with just enough provisions to survive the journey. But Musa was not most pilgrims. He was an emperor. And emperors don't travel. They make statements. Musa spent years preparing for his Hajj. He emptied provincial treasuries. He conscripted an entire city of people to march with him. When the caravan finally left the capital of Niani in 1324, it was 60,000 people strong. Imagine a football stadium. Now imagine that entire stadium walking across the Sahara Desert. There were soldiers, scholars, poets, merchants, and 12,000 slaves to serve the court. There were thousands of goats and sheep driven alongside for food. And then there was the gold. 500 slaves marched at the front, each carrying a staff made of pure gold weighing 6 pounds. 80 camels groaned under the weight of 300 pounds of gold dust, each packed into leather sacks. This was not a pilgrimage. This was a moving treasury. This was a man announcing to the world that Mali was untouchable. As the caravan moved through the desert, Musa began to spend. He didn't believe in hoarding wealth. He believed wealth was a gift from God meant to be shared. If he saw a poor person, he gave them a handful of gold. If he saw a mosque in disrepair, he funded a new one. It said he built a mosque every Friday wherever the caravan stopped to pray. He paid Bedouin guides in raw gold dust. He bought provisions at prices that made sellers weep with gratitude. The rumor of his approach reached Cairo months before he did. The merchants of Cairo were salivating. Cairo was the jewel of the Mamluk Sultanate, the greatest trading hub in the Middle East. Goods from India and China met European markets there. The merchants knew a rich African king was coming. They expected to sell him silk and spices. They expected profits. They had no idea they were about to be annihilated. When Musa arrived at the pyramids of Giza, he set up camp. His encampment was so vast it looked like a new city had materialized overnight. The tents were silk and brocade. The horses wore gold trappings. The soldiers' armor gleamed in the sun. The Sultan of Cairo, Al-Nasir Muhammad, sent an invitation. He wanted to meet this king who traveled with the wealth of legends. But there was a problem. In the Mamluk court, anyone approaching the Sultan had to kiss the ground at his feet. Musa was an emperor. He bowed to no man. He refused. Diplomats scrambled back and forth for days. Finally, a compromise. Musa would visit, but he would only bow to God. When he entered the throne room, he walked past the Sultan and nodded slightly, acknowledging him as an equal. The Sultan accepted. Then Musa opened his purse. He gave the Sultan 50,000 dinars of gold. He gave gold to the viziers, the generals, the scribes. It was a river of metal. The Sultan was charmed. He gave Musa the palace of Carafa to stay in during his visit. That's when the destruction began. Musa stayed in Cairo for 3 months, and for 3 months he went shopping. He visited the famous souks, the markets of Cairo. He saw Turkish silks, Venetian glass, pearls from the Persian Gulf, brasswork, perfumes from Arabia. He bought everything. He didn't haggle. If a merchant said cloth cost 10 dinars, Musa gave him 20. If a horse cost 100 dinars, Musa gave 300. He handed out gold dust like it was sand. The merchants thought they'd died and gone to heaven. They'd never seen a customer like this, so they raised their prices. Musa paid. They raised them again. Musa paid. He flooded the market with gold. Shopkeepers sat on piles of it. Beggars walked around with gold coins. Servants tipped with nuggets. It seemed like a party that would never end. Everyone was rich. Everyone was happy. Musa was the most beloved man in Egypt. They called him the Lion of Mali. They praised his generosity. They prayed for his long life. But while the people celebrated, the invisible hand of economics was tightening around their throats. Economics is the study of scarcity. Gold is valuable because it's rare. If gold becomes as common as sand, it loses its value. Musa had dumped so much gold into the Cairo economy that supply skyrocketed. Suddenly everyone had gold, but the amount of goods, the silk, the food, the horses stayed the same. When you have more money chasing the same amount of goods, prices go up. This is inflation. But this wasn't normal inflation. This was hyperinflation. The value of the gold dinar, the standard currency of the Middle East, began to collapse. Before Musa arrived, a gold dinar bought a certain amount of wheat. After he'd been there a month, that same dinar bought half as much. By the time he left, it bought almost nothing. The merchants realized too late what was happening. They had pockets full of gold, but the gold was worthless. The price of bread doubled. Rent tripled. Middle-class savings evaporated. A man who'd saved for years to buy a house found his savings could only buy a horse. The poor who'd received gifts from the king found the money bought little food because grain prices had soared. Musa had unintentionally nuked the economy of Egypt. He'd killed the currency. But he didn't notice. He was a king, not an economist. He was focused on his spiritual journey. After 3 months of spending, he packed up and headed east toward the Red Sea to cross into Arabia. He left behind a city drowning in gold and choking on inflation. As he marched toward Mecca, the legend spread ahead of him. Bedouin tribes heard a man made of gold was coming. They lined the route, selling him water and guides at extortionate prices. Musa paid without blinking. He arrived in Mecca and performed the rites of Hajj. He circumambulated the Kaaba. He prayed at Mount Arafat. He gave alms to the poor of the holy cities. He gave so much that Mecca and Medina suffered the same fate as Cairo. He crashed their economies too. Historians estimate Musa injected what would be millions of dollars worth of gold into the Middle East in just a few months. It was the largest transfer of wealth in the medieval world. It was done with a smile. It was an act of charity that devastated the recipients. The exchange rate of gold fell by 25%. The entire region was awash in liquidity, but starving for value. At the peak of his glory, Musa had completed his pilgrimage. He was the most famous man in the world. He'd spent a fortune that would bankrupt modern nations. But the journey was only half over. He still had to go home. And as he turned back toward Africa, he faced a new problem. A problem that seemed impossible for the richest man in the world. He was about to run out of money. The journey home is always harder than the journey out. Musa had achieved his spiritual goal. Now he had to lead 60,000 people back across the unforgiving sands to Mali. But the caravan that turned west was different. It was lighter. The 80 camels that carried 300 pounds of gold each were empty. The gold staffs carried by slaves were gone, spent in markets, given as alms, paid to greedy guides. The richest man in history was experiencing a liquidity crisis. He'd spent so much so fast that he'd literally burned through an empire's treasury in less than a year. It seems impossible. But the scale of his entourage and the prices he paid had drained him dry. The man who crashed the world economy with spending was now worried about paying his bills. As the caravan reached Suez and prepared to cross back into Egypt, disaster struck. The winter of 1325 was harsh. Desert nights were freezing. The caravan ran out of food. People began to starve. Camels began to die. Bedouin tribes, seeing the weakened state of the great king, raided the edges of the column. They stole supplies. They kidnapped stragglers. The glorious procession became a march of survival. The glittering robes were tattered, the silk canopies torn. When Musa arrived back in Cairo, he was a changed man. The exuberant spender who'd thrown gold at beggars was now a king in need of a loan. This is the great irony. The man who crashed the value of gold in Cairo now had to borrow gold from the very merchants he'd inadvertently ruined. He went to the great lending houses. The merchants were wary. The value of their currency was still in the toilet because of Musa's previous visit. Gold was cheap and goods expensive. But a king is still a king. And Mali was still the land of gold. So they agreed to lend, but they charged him a predatory interest rate. They gouged him. They lent gold at high interest, knowing he'd pay them back in fresh, high-quality gold from the mines once he returned home. Musa effectively borrowed back the gold he'd given away, but at a massive markup. He financed his own economic destruction. But there was a twist. As Musa borrowed gold and removed it from the Cairo market to pay for supplies, he inadvertently began to fix the problem he'd caused. By taking gold out of circulation, he reduced supply. The price of gold began to stabilize slightly, but the damage was deep. Historians record that the inflation caused by Musa's visit lasted 12 years. It took over a decade for Egypt's economy to return to normal prices. A 12-year recession caused by one man's vacation shopping spree. Think about the scale of that. Musa left Cairo and headed west into the deep desert. The return journey was brutal. Thousands of his followers died of thirst and exhaustion. The desert doesn't care how rich you are. If you don't have water, you die. But Musa survived. And he didn't return empty-handed. While he'd lost his gold, he'd gained something far more valuable: human capital. During his time in Cairo and Mecca, Musa met some of the greatest minds of the Islamic world. He realized Mali was rich in metal, but poor in knowledge. He wanted to change that. He recruited architects, poets, jurists, and scholars to come back with him. He offered salaries that were irresistible. One man he hired was an Andalusian architect named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, a genius from Granada. Musa paid him 200 kilograms of gold to come to Mali. When they returned, Musa set him to work. They stopped in Timbuktu. At the time, Timbuktu was just a seasonal camp for nomads, a trading post on the desert's edge. Musa decided to transform it. With his architect, he built the Jinguereber Mosque. They didn't use stone because stone was rare in the desert. Al-Sahili introduced a new technique: mud bricks reinforced with wood. He created a unique architectural style that still defines the Sahel today. The mosque still stands 700 years later, a testament to vision. It's a masterpiece of organic engineering, cool in summer, warm in winter. Musa also founded the University of Sankore in Timbuktu. He filled it with books he'd bought in Cairo. He encouraged the scholars he brought back to teach. Timbuktu transformed from a dusty outpost into the intellectual capital of Africa. It became a city where books were more valuable than gold. Students traveled from across Africa and the Middle East to study law, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. The Library of Sankore eventually held over 400,000 manuscripts, making it the largest library in Africa since Alexandria. This was the true legacy of the pilgrimage. The gold he gave away vanished. The inflation he caused eventually settled. But the knowledge he brought back built a civilization. He turned Mali from a rich mining state into a center of global culture. But the world outside Mali didn't care about universities. They cared about gold. In 1339, a mapmaker in Majorca named Angelino Dulcert drew a map of the world. On it, he placed the King of Mali. But it was in 1375 that the legend was cemented forever. The Catalan Atlas, the most famous map of the medieval world, was created for the King of France. If you look at it today, your eye is drawn immediately to West Africa. There, sitting on a golden throne, wearing a golden crown, is a picture of a black king. In his right hand, he holds a scepter. In his left, he holds a nugget of gold the size of a grapefruit. The caption reads, "This black lord is called Musa Mali. So abundant is the gold found in his country that he is the richest and most noble king in all the land." This image changed everything. Before this, Europe thought of Africa as a dark, unknown land. Suddenly they saw it as El Dorado. The image of Mansa Musa holding that massive nugget burned itself into the European imagination. It sparked a hunger that would eventually lead to tragedy. Portuguese sailors began sailing down the African coast looking for the river of gold. They were looking for Musa's kingdom. This eventually led to the age of colonization. The wealth Musa displayed so proudly became the bait that drew European empires to West Africa's shores. They came looking for gold. Eventually, they took the people. The fame Musa bought with his pilgrimage led to the destruction of the sovereignty he wanted to project. Mansa Musa died in 1337. He left behind an empire that was the envy of the world. But empires built on resources are fragile. After his death, his sons couldn't hold the vast territory together. The empire began to crumble. Raiders attacked from the north. Rebel provinces broke away. Eventually, the trade routes shifted. The gold of the Americas, discovered by Columbus, flooded the world. The mines of Mali lost their monopoly. But the story of the gold crash remains a unique lesson in economic history. It teaches us about the nature of money. Money is a fiction. It's a shared belief. When Musa walked into Cairo, he proved you can have too much of a good thing. He proved an economy needs balance, not just an injection of cash. He showed that hyperinflation isn't just a modern phenomenon created by central banks. It's a fundamental law of economics that can be triggered by a single man on a shopping spree. Today, Musa is often listed in magazines and websites as the richest person of all time. They estimate his wealth at $400 billion or even incalculable. But these numbers miss the point. You can't measure his wealth in dollars because he owned the source of the dollars. He didn't just have money, he was the money. He controlled the supply of the global reserve currency. His story is a paradox. He's remembered as the ultimate symbol of wealth, but his most famous act was one of economic destruction. He ruined the lives of thousands of Egyptians by trying to be kind to them. He destroyed the value of his own fortune by trying to share it. He inadvertently taught the world that charity without economic understanding can be a curse. Let that sink in. A king tried to be generous and accidentally crippled an economy for more than a decade. Mansa Musa flooded Cairo with gold, handing it out freely to merchants, officials, and the poor. At first it looked like kindness, but when too much gold chased too few goods, prices exploded. Savings evaporated. Money lost meaning. What felt like wealth turned into weight. Families who accepted gifts discovered those gifts could buy less each day. Traders watched years of work collapse overnight. The damage didn't fade quickly. It lingered for 12 long years, shaping an entire generation. This wasn't just a story about riches. It was a lesson about responsibility. Power without understanding becomes dangerous. Musa proved that you can wreck a market with abundance just as easily as with war. By dumping treasure into a foreign economy, he triggered inflation, then borrowed heavily to return home, multiplying the chaos. Bakers couldn't afford flour. Rent soared. Honest workers paid the price for royal spectacle. The myth celebrates the richest man in history. The ledger tells a harsher truth. Wealth without wisdom destroys value. Gold alone isn't strength. Knowledge is. In the end, his coins scattered, but the lesson endured. True prosperity comes from discipline, not display.